statement on Saturday, October 7th, Israelis woke to rockets raining down on them from Gaza and Hamas terrorists breaking down their doors. They were invaded in their homes, brutally murdering over 1,400 people, including over 30 Americans. Hamas terrorists killed babies and toddlers. They killed grandmothers and grandfathers, moms and dads, teenage kids in their home. No one was spared. Innocent civilians slaughtered because of their ancestry and their faith. At least 241 people were taken hostage by Hamas's terrorists and are still being held in Gaza. And one of the most horrific stories to emerge, a pregnant woman had her baby cut out of her and murdered in front of her before they shot her in the head. October 7th was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. I was in one of the kibbutzes right on the border of Gaza last year, meeting with members of the community. I saw their daycare center and the children. That very same kibbutz was overrun by 70 Hamas terrorists. Many of the residents I met were slaughtered, but most viciously, the babies and children I visited in the daycare center were slaughtered, shot to death, beheaded, and even burned alive. Just yesterday, this committee unanimously passed a resolution demanding that Hamas release the hostages. The House also held a bipartisan vigil on the Capitol steps, marking 1 month since October 7th massacre. What the world has seen at the bloody hands of Hamas is simply unfathomable. The depravity of these terrorists knows no bounds. But let me be clear about one thing. All roads lead to Iran. Their fingerprints are all over this attack. They have consistently funded Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups to the tune of $100 million per year. We are witnessing in real time Hamas carry out their covenant from 1988, which states, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And now it's not just Hamas. Hezbollah is launching near daily attacks on northern Israel. The Houthis have launched multiple attacks against Israel. And Iran's proxies in Iraq and Syria have launched at least 41 attacks on U.S. troops since October the 7th. Simply put, the Middle East is on fire. I'm grateful to the Assistant Secretary Leif and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Stroll for appearing before us here today. It's critical that we discuss this dangerous, urgent situation and the administration's response. I've often spoke about the importance of deterrence. The administration is positioning major defense assets in the Middle East. They include 2 carrier strike groups, an Ohio-class nuclear submarine, air defense batteries, U.S. Air Force fighter jets, and additional U.S. servicemen and women. We are also expediting significant arms transfers to Israel so they can defend themselves on every front that is needed. However, deterrence is not only a show of strength, it's not the only show of strength, but the will to use it. Weakness only invites aggression. It is imperative that we continue to project strength and stand united with Israel. Now more than ever, the world is in need of American leadership, and we need it now. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. And with that, I'd like to recognize my dear friend, the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking both of you personally, Ambassador Leif and Assistant Secretary Stroll, as well as your teams at the State and Defense Departments. We not only recognize the excellent work you are doing, but we also know how hard it is at the human level to deal with such a crisis. As we hold this hearing, Israel is at war with Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, following the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. What we've seen unfold on our TVs and in our newspapers over the last 4 weeks has been extraordinarily painful. It has been extraordinarily painful to watch. Hamas terrorists killed more than 1,400 innocent civilians, women, men, children, elderly, and babies in cold blood. Following this, Hamas has used thousands of Palestinians, including far too many children, as human shields. These images of death and destruction in Gaza, if you're human, they have to haunt you. I know it haunts me, and I will never shake them. Hamas has made it clear to all of us watching that they do not exist to serve the Palestinian people. Hamas does not want peace. Hamas doesn't want a Palestinian state living side by side with a Jewish state. There was a ceasefire on October the 6th, and it was Hamas who broke it in the most terrible way possible. It is Hamas who's holding some of the Palestinian people from getting to the south and other safe places. And so I applaud the Biden administration for working to address the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza brought on by Hamas and their war. You know, Hamas could end this today. Just surrender. And nobody else gets killed. Just surrender. The United States has provided an initial contribution of $100 million and will be providing more upon passage of a comprehensive supplemental bill. We are calling for humanitarian pauses, which would allow humanitarian goods to enter and for civilians to get out of harm's way. And we continue to support the establishment of safe zones where Gazans can seek shelter. We have helped facilitate the movement of life-saving supplies into Gaza through Egypt and are working to increase these deliveries. Ambassador Leaf, I hope you can share with us some additional details about the administration's work to support Gaza's civilians despite the extraordinary challenging conditions. I had hoped also that our body would have taken the matter of funding for Israel and the humanitarian crises unfolding around the world in Gaza with the same seriousness as the administration has, quite frankly. But unfortunately, I don't believe we have. Instead, with the new speaker, Speaker Johnson, and his leadership, seems to me that last week we played some politics with our national security. Support for funding for Israel, time and again, has been a bipartisan manner that Congress has kept out of politics. And we have given Israel aid without any conditions. It is unfortunate that at this critical time, that has changed. Speaker Johnson brought an Israel-only supplemental to the floor. This supplemental is unprecedented. It conditions aid to Israel on domestic policy objective and stands no chance of passing through the United States Senate. The United States has an indispensable role to play in the world, and I hope for Israel and our own sake that we don't play politics and don't play political games. We must pass a comprehensive supplemental for Israel. It's also interconnected with what we have to do in Ukraine, interconnected what we have to do for Taiwan. And I would also include our southern border as soon as possible. These issues are connected and should be free of politics. They are about our national security and America's leadership globally. So I want to conclude by raising an issue that the United States, Israel, and other regional partners must address. What does a successful ground operation in Gaza look like, and who will administer the Gaza Strip if Israel's efforts to remove Hamas is successful? So I'm going to be raising those questions. So in the days, weeks, and months ahead, I know the United States will continue to stand steadfastly with Israel to assure its long-term security. We will also, as President Biden has outlined, remain committed to ensuring that civilians in Gaza have access to safe areas and continue to have access to food, water, medical care, and other assistance without diversions by Hamas. We must also stay keenly focused on working to get U.S. citizens and their immediate family members to exit Gaza safely and bring all of our hostages home. So let me end by just saying thank you once again to our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you in a short while. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. And let me just say, I too agree we need to move swiftly on a national security aid package that both addresses the threat from Russia to Ukraine and Europe, the threat from communist China to Taiwan and the Pacific, the threat from the Ayatollah in Iran to Israel by its proxies, and the southwest border, which is the last line of defense to stop these threats from coming in. I find it amazing the extent to which Russia and Iran have lined up against Israel in this epic struggle. We're pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us here today on this important topic. The Honorable Barbara Leaf, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the Department of State. Ms. Dana Stroll, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the Department of Defense. This committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us, and we're very grateful to have both state and DOD here at the same time to speak with us here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Leaf for her opening statement.
Sorry. Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this important set of issues. While I'm here about Gaza, I want to underscore the urgency of the President's full supplemental assistance requests, including $3.5 billion in FMF for Israel, $200 million in State Department operational funds to meet the needs of embassy security and U.S. citizen services in this crisis, and $10 billion in global humanitarian assistance. I returned Monday from the region from 2 weeks in the region. I joined Secretary Blinken for meetings with our Israeli and Arab partners aimed at demonstrating support for Israel's self-defense, consistent with international humanitarian law, preventing the conflict from spreading, securing release of Hamas's hostages, including American citizens, and addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The Secretary urged Israeli leaders to work humanitarian pauses into their campaign to allow more critical aid into Gaza, to enable civilians to access aid and move to safer locations, and to further the release of hostages. He also underscored the U.S. commitment to a negotiated two-state solution as the only way to achieve a just, durable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We met regional partners who, like us, see Iran and its proxies working to exploit this crisis. We made clear that we will not stand by idly if others join or escalate the conflict. The October 7th Hamas terrorist attack was the worst attack on Israel since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, but no prior conflict targeted Israeli civilians to this extent. Many said the terrorist attack evoked the trauma of the Holocaust. How Israel conducts this war matters deeply. The U.S. stands unequivocally for the protection of civilian lives during conflict. We mourn the thousands of Palestinian civilians killed. Palestinians must not suffer the consequences for Hamas's terrorist acts. As the Secretary said in Israel, there will be no partners for peace if they're consumed by humanitarian catastrophe and alienated by any perceived indifference to their plight. In support of U.S. citizens, the Department has had a task force operating 24/7 to coordinate U.S. government efforts since October 7th to protect them and our diplomatic personnel and facilities. Over 14,000 U.S. citizens and family members have departed Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza since October 7th. Some 1,500 departures were directly facilitated by the U.S. government. Since November 1st, more than 400 U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, and family members have exited Gaza via the Rafah crossing. Nearly all of our locally employed staff and their families have departed as well. There are about 700 U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, and family members in Gaza requesting assistance to depart, and we're making every effort to enable their departure. Securing the release of U.S. nationals taken hostage by Hamas is an overriding priority, and we appreciate Qatar's and Egypt's forthright and tireless assistance. The Secretary has also instructed our Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, to do everything possible to support these efforts. He has the full backing of our embassies in Cairo, Jerusalem, and Doha. To prevent a wider conflict, our message is clear. Iran and its proxies should stay out of the conflict. Secretary Blinken discussed with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas the critical role the Palestinian Authority security forces play in preventing conflict in areas under their control in the West Bank, and we've seen serious work in that direction. We have also urged Israel to uphold the rule of law and rein in extremist settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. This violence inflames an already explosive security environment. President Biden appointed Ambassador David Satterfield, one of our most seasoned career diplomats, to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. As a result of U.S. leadership, Rafah is open and over 560 truckloads of life-saving supplies have entered Gaza. They're hardly sufficient, but it is a work in progress. We've urged Israel to restore access to electricity and water and allow sufficient levels of fuel for desalination, distribution of humanitarian goods, wastewater treatment, medical care, and basic activities for civilians. Our partners are scrutinizing our response, as are our strategic competitors. After years of false narratives claiming the U.S. is abandoning the region, we are demonstrating we will stand resolutely by our ally and our partners. As others offer hollow statements, the U.S. conducts hard-nosed diplomacy, finding solutions. But we must be clear-eyed about what lies ahead. The Secretary heard from our regional partners that their imperative is the immediate protection of Palestinian civilians, thus the unstinting calls for a ceasefire. They fear the irreparable displacement of the Palestinian people in this crisis. They want to know how much political capital the U.S. is willing to invest towards a two-state solution, and they want U.S. leadership. I close by thanking this committee for your continued support. The Biden administration is poised to work with you to hold Hamas accountable, to prevent the widening of the conflict, to protect civilians. We cannot return to the environment before October 7th for either Israel or the Palestinians. I look forward to your questions.
Recognize Deputy Assistant Secretary Stroll for her opening statement.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today alongside Assistant Secretary Leaf. The Department's commitment to Israel's right to defend itself from terrorism is ironclad. We mourn the Israelis, Americans, and citizens of countries around the world who were murdered by Hamas on October 7th. We also mourn the thousands of Palestinian civilians who have died during this conflict. The Department of Defense has organized our efforts along the following lines. First, protecting American forces and interests in the region. Second, supporting Israel's right to defend itself, consistent with international humanitarian law. Third, coordinating closely with Israel on hostage recovery efforts. And fourth, containing the conflict to Gaza. The volume of disinformation and misinformation perpetuating false narratives about this conflict is deeply troubling. The Department of State designated Hamas a foreign terrorist organization in 1997. Hamas is responsible for the abhorrent terrorist attack in Israel, and Israel is executing military operations to ensure that Hamas is never again able to perpetuate a terrorist attack like it did in October. Hamas is using civilians as human shields, blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid, and while having released 4 hostages, continues to hold at least 200 civilians, including Americans. Palestinian civilians are not terrorists, must have immediate access to life-saving humanitarian aid, and deserve to live in peace, security, and dignity in a state of their own. As the Department of Defense works along the 4 lines of effort I articulated, Iran-backed militia groups are attacking U.S. forces. Since October 17th, U.S. bases and facilities in Iraq and Syria have been attacked 41 times. On October 26, at President Biden's direction, U.S. forces conducted precision self-defense strikes on facilities in eastern Syria used and operated by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and its affiliates. We will not hesitate to take further necessary measures to protect our people. To underscore, in response to a pattern of Iranian and Iran-backed attacks against U.S. personnel and facilities in Iraq and Syria, and the continuing threat of future such attacks, the United States has taken, and as necessary, will continue to take military action against the IRGC and its affiliates. This includes the use of force against IRGC and IRGC-affiliated personnel and facilities in the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility, with the intention to convince the Iranians to de-escalate threats against the United States, our interests, and our people. Current U.S. posture in the Middle East is significant, and DoD has demonstrated its ability to rapidly project additional power into the theater. Since October 7th, we have deployed THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems, additional fighter squadrons, 2 carrier strike groups, and an Ohio-class nuclear-powered guided missile submarine. We also placed over 2,000 personnel and a range of units on a heightened state of readiness, some of which subsequently deployed. These deployments demonstrate our commitment to Israel's security, to regional stability, and to deterring those who seek to widen this conflict. It also bolsters the department's ability to respond quickly to the evolving security environment. With respect to supporting Israel, we are working around the clock to determine which munitions and equipment from U.S. inventory can quickly be made available. Air defense is a high priority, as are medical supplies, artillery ammunition, and precision-guided munitions. Deliveries are taking place on a near-daily basis. With respect to supporting the release of hostages held by Hamas, the department sent U.S. military personnel to Israel to provide advice and intelligence support. We are also conducting unarmed UAV flights over Gaza only to support hostage recovery. Finally, the Department of Defense is acutely focused on the importance of obligations related to civilian protection. Under the law of war, all parties to armed conflict must comply with rules for the protection of civilians. In this war, protecting and supporting civilians is difficult for a range of reasons, including the fact that it is happening in a densely populated urban environment, that Hamas is using civilians as human shields, and because Hamas placed rockets and weapons in civilian areas while digging terror tunnels underneath civilian infrastructure and protected sites like schools and hospitals. We make clear to Israel every day that efforts to mitigate and respond to civilian harm are both a moral and strategic imperative. As the Secretary's Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan states, hard-earned tactical and operational successes may ultimately end in strategic failure if care is not taken to protect the civilian environment as much as the situation allows. That is precisely what the Department of Defense is doing.